grave.
Clearly it wasn't any accidental death. I mean, she was the victim of a murder.
But before police could catch the killer, they'd need to identify the victim.
Normally with most crimes, you want to investigate what has happened. Well, we couldn't even begin to investigate what had happened in this case, really, because first of all, we needed to know who this person was.
Could a unique form of forensic science unlock the mystery?
You put a skull in the front of the newspaper and say, does anybody recognize this person? And you'll get diddly. Put a reconstruction there, and somebody will react to it.
This is forensics, catching the killer.
Water Police Station, which at the time was the divisional headquarters. I think the first thing I thought of was this could become my second home for the next few months, because I quickly got an idea of just how big the investigation was, with the number of officers and staff that had been mobilised and the number of police vehicles that were around. It just felt absolutely huge, and, you know, the biggest investigation I'd worked on up until that time.
In December 1989, DS Jeff Norman was part of a 100-strong team of detectives from South Wales Police, drafted in to solve a brutal murder.
You felt that bit more pressure, and you knew the whole team was going to be in the spotlight, so it was going to attract an awful lot of public interest, so you were just determined to try and make sure that you got the best possible result.
It's an investigation that would turn out to be far from routine. In the shadow of the Principality Stadium and next to the River Taff is Fitzhamon Embankment, once one of the city's most desirable addresses. By the late 1980s, many of its large Victorian terraced houses had been converted into flats and bedsits. It was a disturbing discovery in the rear garden of one home that would launch one of Wales's biggest murder inquiries. Journalist Martin Shipton covered the discovery of the bones for the city's main newspaper.
There were some workmen who were in a garden, and they were digging up the ground and buried not very far below the surface. In fact, I believe it was 22 inches. They came across the body, or rather the skeleton, of somebody who clearly was unidentified. So this was a major story at the time, and obviously that was a pretty horrendous thing for anyone to find.
It wasn't unusual in those days for us to get calls about bones being discovered in gardens when people are digging them up, and more often than not, they turned out to be animal bones. But this one looked a little bit different. With the flax, it just didn't look right.
It was an extreme challenge for the police to identify the victim of this murder, because while there were a few items of clothing, clearly one couldn't identify who it was from the face, because the face was no longer in existence. It was a skull. There was a skeleton. The details were extremely sketchy.
But of course, there was a drive and determination that not only did we need to identify this person, we also needed to find out how she'd come to that awful end. There was a real determination to find out exactly what had happened. So we immediately called in the Forensic Science Service and the pathologist.
With only bones, fragments of clothing, and the carpet the body was wrapped in as evidence, could forensics tell detectives who this unknown person was and how long they'd been buried for?
The Home Office pathologist was the first one to start putting us on the road with the information that we needed to identify what it was we were dealing with.
What usually happens is that the pathologist will go along to the scene and have a look at what is there and see whether there are any injuries or anything like that present that he or she can identify, but also to look at what type of skeleton it is, to see how tall the skeleton is, how tall the person was, what sex the person is, the gender, to a great extent, the ethnicity. They will have a lot of important information that they can get from the skeleton by looking at the size of the bones.
The forensic pathologist's report helped determine the bones belonged to a girl aged between 14 and 17. But the skeleton wasn't the only thing that could reveal vital information about the age of the girl and when she might have been buried.
The other items of interest that were of great use to us were items of clothing that had remained. Obviously, some of the synthetic bits and pieces had not broken down, as had the rest of the material. We had buttons, we had a zip, we had clothing labels, all of which would give us some information that we could use, importantly, to try and start building up a timeline. We could identify from that, we hoped, when they were manufactured, and we could start homing in on a date or dates between that body might have been buried in the ground.
Inquiries into her clothing revealed that the items hadn't been produced for at least 5 years. Officers now knew the sex and approximate age of the victim and potentially how long she'd been buried. And the pathologist also confirmed to detectives that she'd been forcibly restrained.
What was also of great interest to us, as if it wasn't suspicious enough at that stage, was the fact that he was able to reveal that her arms had been tied behind her back.
The forensic pathology report provided vital clues to assist the investigation. But detectives working the case now needed to establish who this unfortunate child was and why she'd been killed. December 1989, and murder detectives in Cardiff were on the hunt for a killer. A skeleton had been found wrapped in carpet and buried in a shallow grave close to the centre of the Welsh capital. But before they could find the offender, they desperately needed to identify the victim. From the forensic pathologist's report, investigators now knew she was a teenage girl aged between 14 and 17. But they still had no idea who this young girl, nicknamed Little Miss Nobody, was.
People working on the team had children, and the overriding memory is that people were talking, how come this person hasn't been missed? Why hasn't she been reported missing? There were no missing persons records that we could find that could potentially link what we'd found in that rear garden to a missing person.
It wasn't just detectives who were questioning how this could happen.
When the body was found, there was a lot of shock in Cardiff because the location is one which will be known to very many people. It's very close to the city centre. It's just across the river from the big rugby stadium in the centre of the city. And people will know that area and will not think that anything of this kind could possibly happen there. And I think there was a great deal of shock when it was discovered that the victim was as young as she was.
So there was a steely determination to do what was right for her. Clearly, at some stage, there were people that should have been looking out for her, but hadn't. So, that was our job.
Determining how long the girl had been buried would help give detectives a time frame in which to search. Once again, could science provide the evidence of when she died?
One of the most important forensic breakthroughs we had was identifying an entomologist who was able to look at what was found within the bundle of carpet and also at the scene. What the entomologist was able to tell us and explain to us was that the way in which a body decomposes when it's in the ground. And that happens largely through the way that insects attack them and the different insects that do different things.
The insect life was very helpful in explaining how long she had been in a situation where there weren't any insects around, and then placed somewhere where they were able to get to her. And I believe the entomologist also, or the insect man, shall we say, also was able to show that from the type of insects that were around, that she'd been dead for at least 5 years, and where insects had access to her.
And he was also able to tell us that it would have been lain above ground after death and prior to burial, which again to us was of great importance, and it just heightens the suspicions that we had that this was somebody who had met a violent death.
It meant police could now start to focus their inquiries on a specific time period, starting with the residents of the flats on Fitzhammon Embankment.
It was pretty obvious to us, given that the grave was some 6 feet from the rear basement flat door of the property. It was likely that the person living in that property at the time must have known something about what had gone on. So we knew who was living in the basement flat around the time that we were being pointed in by the scientists.
Detectives' next line of inquiry centred on the carpet that the girl's body had been wrapped in.
A resident of the basement flat was able to tell us that she recognised that carpet, as it had been one that she'd selected when the landlord asked her to, when it needed recarpeting. And she thought that it might have been an offcut that had remained after the carpet had been fitted and kept in a cupboard under the stairs. So a lot of our research was done on those residents, and the residents of the basement flat were of particular importance to us. And it was through some of those inquiries that we discovered not only the person that had lived there when the carpet had been laid, but also when Alan Charlton had lived there.
But just who was Alan Charlton?
So it's here in the centre of Cardiff, in one of the what is now pedestrian streets, Caroline Street, where Alan Charlton used to work as a bouncer at the XL Club, which was here. He was somebody who was quite muscular and obviously appealed to the employers, the people who ran the club, because they thought that he looked the sort of person who would be able to deal with any kind of trouble.
And trouble would often find its way to this area of the capital, in part due to its location close to the city's main transport hub and a notorious hangout for ne'er-do-wells.
Not far away was the bus station, where there was a cafe known as Asti's Cafe, where one would see young girls standing outside, hovering around, and they were often runaways of one kind or another, people who were lost, and actually they were pretty vulnerable people, but they formed part of an underclass in Cardiff, almost a parallel society that Alan Charlton was also part of. And I suppose, in a sense, he straddled two elements, because he was employed as a bouncer, so he was in gainful employment, but he also had an extremely unhealthy interest in young girls, which led him into associating with these very unfortunate, vulnerable people.
He was very much a ladies' man. He was known to throw lots of parties, including at the basement flat, and that women attended that flat, but also some younger girls too.
Investigators now had a person of interest. Meanwhile, another forensic discipline was helping detectives piece together how the young girl had died.
As part of the identification process, we also used the services of an odontologist. He was able to look at the teeth, confirming the age range the pathologist had come up with. Another key finding of Dr. Whitaker's work was the blood that he found within the teeth themselves.
But I believe that Professor Whitaker found what we call pink teeth, which is one of the signs that's said to be associated with strangulation. That may well be the case, but we have to remember that pink teeth can occur in all sorts of situations when somebody is in the process of dying, particularly if there is a loss of oxygen to the body.
So it was clear to us that this person had met a violent death, which fitted in with what we'd found from some of the other forensic sciences.
Charlton's residence, just feet from where the body was found, had already put him on the investigators' radar. Now the forensic confirmation of the young girl's violent death, tied in with the nightclub bouncer's previous run-ins with the law, raised suspicion further.
Alan Charlton was of significant interest to us from that early stage because he was well known to other police forces. He appeared to be a violent offender and had been the suspect in rape investigations, in assault investigations where there was evidence that women had been attacked.
But those suspicions had not led to charges, and Charlton denied any knowledge of the body found just feet away from where he used to live. Still without a name for the dead girl, the investigation needed a breakthrough. That would come courtesy of a relic dating back to 800 years BC.
It all started with an Egyptian mummy, and that really was the start of my involvement with the forensic fraternity.
Murder Squad detectives in Cardiff were frantically trying to identify the body of Little Miss Nobody, a teenage girl whose skeletal remains had been found buried in the garden of a flat close to the city centre in December 1989. They also had a prime suspect, nightclub bouncer Alan Charlton, but without knowing who the dead girl was and her possible connection to their suspect, police couldn't progress the case against him. Detectives now gambled on a new forensic technique to unravel the mystery of their victim.
Crucial to the identification of this person was to try and put a face to that person. And we decided that a course of action that would assist us in doing just that might be to try and recreate from the skull that we'd found what that person might have looked like. Now, in those days, I had no idea that something like that could be done.
The man leading this pioneering process was Professor Richard Neve.
I was employed by the University of Manchester, and I was working in the medical school as an artist, which involved at that time making drawings and paintings of various anatomical and surgical procedures. Also, it involved making exhibitions and displays. The university had embarked upon a sort of interdepartmental project to unwrap and study an ancient Egyptian mummy in the university's museum. And this had a number of spin-offs, and one of them was for me to take the remains of the skull and to build a face.
As part of the Manchester Mummy Project, Professor Neve was tasked with rebuilding the shattered skull of Mummy 1770 to create a model of how the Egyptian princess might have looked.
I actually reconstructed the face of this little mummy girl, and the resulting publicity kind of went a long way. And that really was the start of my involvement with the forensic fraternity, purely and simply because of the publicity that the mummy had generated. And it became one of the few options that a police force would have in trying to identify an otherwise unidentifiable body.
Detectives from South Wales, including Jeff Norman, were soon heading to Manchester to utilise Professor Neave's unique skills.
I took the skull to Manchester, and I remember taking it in a cardboard box. It seemed very, very weird at the time, but clearly it was really important because this was something that could potentially lead to the identification of this person. He was confident that he would be able to come up with an image for us that might be able to jog somebody's memory.
After making a cast of the skull, Professor Neave began to painstakingly rebuild Little Miss Nobody's face.
I used modelling clay and developed basically the underlying muscle structures of the face. So the muscles that form around the eye and the mouth and the muscles of the cheeks, and building up all these muscles, controlled to some extent by the measurements which have been placed into the skull. The face will grow from the surface of the skull out. It is not an artistic exercise at all.
After around 5 days of meticulous modelling, Professor Neave had finally given Little Miss Nobody a face.
What we're looking at here is a photograph of the reconstruction. You can see she's got a fairly straight sort of forehead. As with most females, the brow ridges are relatively light. And then she's got a fairly light sort of chin, very female sort of chin. It's a typical teenage face.
The forensic facial reconstruction produced by Professor Neave was initially met with scepticism by investigators.
I have to say it was very strange when we saw the image that he produced, because the first thing I was thinking of, and I know after discussing it with colleagues, we thought the same thing. Does that look like a real person? Is that something that people are going to look at and say, I know who that is?
There were limitations, but you put a skull in the front of the newspaper and say, does anybody recognise this person? And you'll get diddly, no matter how big the story. Put a reconstruction there, and somebody will react to it.
And when the image was released to the media, detectives did get a reaction.
We went to press both locally and also went to Crime Watch to make an appeal. We had a lot of calls, but there were 2 calls of particular interest to us. One from a person who worked in a social services care home in Pontypridd to the north of Cardiff, and they gave the same name as another person had phoned in with.
40 days into their murder investigation, police were finally able to give the girl known as Little Miss Nobody her real identity back.
That name was Karen Price.
Karen Price was quite a troubled young girl. At the time of what occurred, she was 15. She obviously had a troubled childhood because she was living in an assessment centre at a place called Church Village, which is near Pontypridd, which is approximately 10 or 12 miles to the north of Cardiff.
And this is the children's home, or the entrance to the children's home. The walls. This is the home that I spent 2.5 years in. And obviously, this is the home that Karen lived. Or it was.
Lee Hatch was a resident here along with Karen Price in 1981.
11 years of age, you're thinking, what? Where am I going? You know, my school isn't like this. My house isn't like this. This is new. It's different. There's good memories. But seeing the building itself brought back the bad memories as well. The first thing I thought about was the bedroom there. Not the veranda that I jumped off. Not a gang of us in the doorway smoking. Karen would have been in this section here. This was then the television area. The other side of that was the games room. The dining area would have been them two windows. She always had something in her hair, always. She was sort of Bananarama-esque way before they even thought about it. It was either a hat pulled down over her eyes or some sort of bandana or a scarf. And she always liked wearing men's shirts, which I found really strange. You know, she wasn't a girly girl.
Like many other kids in care at the centre, Karen often found herself at odds with staff. The solution? To abscond.
I would say there was at least one a week. You know, it's... and it might be that it wasn't proper absconding. You know, you'd have an argument with somebody, you'd run off, everybody'd start phoning round, they worried about you, and you'd walk back in. 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 hours.
Obviously, she wasn't happy there because she was absconding from the establishment, as did some of her contemporaries as well. And what would tend to happen would be that when they did that, they would come down to Cardiff.
The first time I saw Karen abscond and get into the car was this end of the building. And we heard a commotion coming from the house. Then, all of a sudden, we seen her run down, and she came round the corner. The car was sort of parked at that angle, and she just ran down and jumped straight into the back of it. And he drove off and down around.
Could that mystery man in the car have been Alan Charlton?
You could see he was a grown man, but you couldn't see his face. You could only see him at an acute angle. And then, by the time I come round, she was in the back of the car and the car had gone round the corner.
According to Lee, he saw Karen get into waiting cars on several occasions, but she'd always returned.
If you went missing, most of the time, the friends knew where you'd gone. You know? There was no mobile phone, but word of mouth. Eventually, somebody would crack, and they'd say to the staff, oh, he's gone here. You know, and then it's like, oh, well, back you come.
For Karen, it seemed nobody did crack when she failed to reappear.
The boys were capable of living their lives. The girls looked scared. Karen included. I suppose a troubled soul, really, because I don't think she had anybody that, same as we all did, I don't think she had anybody that she could actually talk to and tell what was going on.
Nobody would report her disappearance or that she hadn't returned to the home or to school. In life as in death, Karen Price was a little Miss Nobody. But just who had been responsible for her murder? Back in late 80s Cardiff, a team of murder squad detectives had been trying to identify the remains of a young girl found buried in a shallow grave. A forensic facial reconstruction using the girl's skull had allowed investigators to give Little Miss Nobody a face. And a UK-wide press and TV campaign resulted in officers putting a name to the face: Karen Price. Now, another new forensic technique, pioneered by pathologist Peter Venezes, helped confirm the skull definitely was Karen's.
Well, what stands out about this particular case for me was that it was actually probably the first case that I did where we were involved in a murder inquiry with facial superimposition. Certainly one of the first in this country, as far as I'm aware.
Using a photograph police now had of Karen, Dr. Venezes was able to compare that to her skull found in the shallow grave.
Basically, what we did was we took an image of the skull, which was then recorded. That was used as our first image. We could then, because we had the skull there, we could turn it round into different positions, so we could match it up with the angle at which the photograph we had. So we took into account the perspective. And by doing that at the different angles, we could then see whether different parts of the anatomy of the skull matched up with different parts of the anatomy of the photograph. And also, because she was smiling, we were able to see the outline of the teeth, both in the photograph and in the skull itself. So that was very useful. And actually, not just in her case, but it was a very useful technique that we used in a number of other murder cases that we did over that time.
And the now tried and tested forensic technique of DNA sampling, still in its early days back then, would provide the ultimate proof the bones belonged to Karen.
They really had to do this because the facial reconstruction and superimposition was all very well, but you needed something which was completely definitive. This is when they went to Sir Alec Jeffreys, and he advised them to go to the families and get samples.
In the early 1980s, geneticist Sir Alec Jeffreys had developed the revolutionary technique of genetic fingerprinting and DNA profiling. 2 years before Karen's remains were discovered, Jeffreys' technique had led to the world's first murder conviction using DNA. Colin Pitchfork, whose semen had been found at the scene of the rapes and murders of both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, received a 28-year prison sentence. Now, similar science, taking DNA from Karen's estranged parents, could prove a familial link to the bones found in the garden.
They then were able to get the samples, and that's when they were able to match these with the samples that were taken from the bones at that time, and it was successful. I believe Sir Alec Jeffreys in court said that that there was a 99.9% chance that it was Karen Price.
Forensics had identified the victim. Now detectives in Cardiff needed hard evidence against the man they suspected of Karen Price's murder. And they were about to receive a call that would break the case wide open.
I was watching TV with my friend Idris, his partner and my partner. Crime Watch came on, and they were talking about a young girl, Karen Price, who had gone missing in Cardiff, and her body was found. Idris had said that he knew her and he knew her boyfriend and somebody she was hanging around with.
Idris Ali had been 16 at the time of Karen's murder. 8 years on, he had a girlfriend and a son and was sharing a house with Make Corcoran in Cardiff.
Nick Ross concluded the programme by saying, if you were a friend of her then, be a friend of hers now. And I repeated those words to Idris. If you were a friend of her then, be a friend of her now. The police are looking for any information. If you know the boyfriend, that might give them a clue as to what might be going on.
Officers were dispatched immediately to speak to Idris Ali. And then he was interviewed over a number of days. And he eventually told us that he had actually supplied young girls to Alan Charlton to attend at some of the parties that he used to have at his basement flat. At one of these parties, 2 girls had been invited. He'd actually supplied them.
One of those girls was Karen, and the other, only 13 at the time, would provide detectives with the vital evidence they needed against Alan Charlton.
She was able to tell us that there was a party, that she was there with Karen. Alan Charlton had asked both girls to undress so that he could take photographs of them on the bed. Karen refused, and as a result of her refusal, Alan Charlton struck her. She told us that as a result of that first blow by Alan Charlton, Karen Price was nearly certainly unconscious, possibly even dead already. But Alan Charlton tied her hands behind her back, put her on the bed, and continued to assault her, despite the efforts of both her and Idris Ali in preventing him from doing so.
The key witness would also confirm the forensic analysis about what happened to Karen in the days after she'd been murdered.
Idris Ali was able to tell us that the body wasn't buried immediately, that it had been kept in the basement flat for several days, whilst Alan Charlton was deciding what to do with it. But he was then made by Charlton to return to the flat to assist him in disposing of the body in the grave in the rear garden.
After almost a decade, the tragic story of a girl society had chosen to forget was finally being told, thanks in no small part to forensic science.
I think it's fair to say that this was a hugely significant investigation for anybody who worked on it. The teamwork was outstanding, not just from within the police officers themselves and the other members of staff that were involved, but also the forensic science teams that were involved and so worked closely together with the investigation team itself.
Looking back on it, I suppose one feels, or I feel a sense of doing a job properly and getting the right results. And knowing I've got the right results. That is always a good thing to do.
Yeah, I made a point the whole time I was there, keeping an eye on Charlton, just totally impassive, almost as if he wasn't even listening. I don't know. Just, you know, sometimes you get people in the dock who are writing copious notes, who are constantly wanting to talk to their legal team. He just sat there the whole time, never said anything to anybody. Very strange individual.
What we know about Alan Charlton and the perception that other people had of him is very largely determined by what happened in this case. So we know, for example, that Idris Ali, who was his co-accused, was terrified of him, and that he wouldn't want to cross him, and that he was, in fact, induced to participate in the killing by him because of his fear of him. So he must have had a very powerful, controlling personality. That's absolutely clear.
A jury would find Charlton guilty of Karen's murder and sentence him to life with a minimum of 15 years in prison.
Now, this was in 1991, and the 15 years clearly was up in 2006, but to this day, he remains in prison. Very often it's the case that if defendants refuse to accept their guilt, they will not be released.
You know, if he comes out, heaven help somebody, because he is a dangerous, dangerous man. I hope he never gets out.
Ali was also convicted of murder, but his conviction changed to manslaughter at a retrial in 1994.
I think it was a real achievement to successfully not only convict the people responsible for her death, but to even identify her in the first place, given what we started with, which was literally a bag of bones.
The police investigation might have delivered justice for Karen, but the question remained, how had a vulnerable young girl been allowed to simply vanish without the alarm being raised?
One of the huge sadnesses about this case is that one could say that people were more caring about Karen after her death than they had been during her life. If she had been cared for in the way that she deserved, as everybody deserves, as every vulnerable person deserves, then she wouldn't have ended up in the appalling situation that led to her losing her life.
I mean, me personally, I find that too difficult to comprehend. Really too difficult to comprehend, because...
Bizarre twists that turn the investigation on its head.
It was all baloney. There wasn't a shred of truth in it.
And the science that could crack the case.
The amount of blood that I saw led me to believe that somebody had been seriously injured there.
This is Forensics, Catching the Killer. One of the largest reservoirs in England, Rutland Water covers an area of over 11.5 square kilometres of the country's smallest county. Created in 1976, it's been a haven for wildlife, as well as people seeking peace and tranquility from nearby Leicester and Peterborough ever since.
In the day, it's an extremely busy place. It's popular with the dog walkers, fishermen, cyclists, plenty of cyclists around. But then at night, you wouldn't expect to see anything. The car parks are all closed off. So to see any movement in here or around here at night is quite unusual, really.
Back in 1993, Richard Hallam was a daily visitor to the reservoir.
I was 21 at the time, and I was working at a local country club. Part of my job was to work on the night shift so that we could reassemble rooms overnight, change projectors, cameras, that kind of stuff for delegates the next day. Also on the night shift, there's a security guy that would work with us as well. And occasionally we would swap duties, help each other out. He did some of my work, I did some of his work. And the particular night in question, I said to the guy, I said, do you want me to do your patrol? He said, yeah, do my patrol. So part of the job was to walk around the site, checking at various points around the country club, one of which was the gatehouse. It must have been 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, something like that. Walking back to the country club from the gatehouse, I looked over the water and I could see a car going down the track that you can see over there. Side lights on, not main headlights, just the side lights, but making its way down this track that you can see through the trees over there, making its way along to what we know as Armley Woods, which is just over there. I thought it was odd, but other than that, never really twigged. Just carried on with the patrol. At that time, of course, there was no inquiry, there was nobody missing or anything like that. So it was just one of those things, It is the first time that I've been back to this spot since that November in '93, and strange and quite chilling feeling, really,
With a population of less than 800,000, Rutland is hardly a crime hotspot, and it's one of the quieter beats for Leicestershire Constabulary, which police the county.
Rutland itself, it was a very rural area, beautiful countryside, and of course we'd got the reservoir, which was a massive tourist attraction. So you were getting people there from all different walks of society.
Back in 1993, former Detective Chief Superintendent Steve Johnson was the area commander in Rutland.
You could sort of count the number of crimes that they'd have there on your hand. And if there was a crime, everybody knew about it, and everybody seemed to know what everybody else was doing. It was a very sort of insular sort of existence there for people. There were quite a lot of retired people who obviously came there to see out their years because it was such a quiet, beautiful place to live.
Two of those retired people were 68-year-old Derek and 69-year-old Eileen Severs, who'd moved to the area from York several years earlier.
The Severs family were very well known. Derek and Eileen lived quite an affluent lifestyle. They'd settled into the community in Rutland, and Derek liked to pint at his local pub, the Finches, and he went everywhere in his Blue Rover because he had mobility problems. He'd retired but still did little bits of work here and there. Mrs. Severs was very active. She was involved in all the charitable groups locally, and her involvement even led to her being awarded an MBE for helping prisoners at the local prison, HMP Ashwell.
Well-known, well-liked and well-meaning, the Severs had a busy social life. But in November 1993, this active couple unexpectedly dropped off the Rutland water radar.
The first people to start raising alarms were friends and people from different clubs and societies that the Severs family belonged to. They were involved in lots of community activities and fundraising for charities, etc. And because of that, they were creatures of habit. They were very punctual when they went to places. And on this occasion, I do believe that Mrs. Severs had made arrangements to deliver raffle prizes from a fundraising event, and she hadn't turned up.
They went missing on Saturday, and by Thursday, the 18th of November, people were worried and anxious about where they were.
With concerns raised, police initially treated Derek and Eileen's case as a missing persons inquiry.
When people went missing, there were set procedures, really. An officer would visit and make an initial assessment, and invariably people were found very quickly. So they never sort of progressed to the next stage, which would have been a more intensive checking up on all of their friends. Really, it was doing all the nuts and bolts to try and establish whether they'd gone voluntarily or whether there was something more suspicious that was going on.
As they took initial statements from worried friends of Derek and Eileen, they questioned them to establish a timeline for their last known movements.
The last sighting of Mrs. Severs was at a charity bazaar in Oakham at 1:30 p.m. on the 13th of November. The last sighting of Mr. Severs was that he'd had a pint in his local pub, the Finches, on the same day.
Most missing people are found safe and well within the first 24 hours. But 5 days had passed since anyone had seen or heard from Eileen and Derek. With concerns mounting, officers drove to their home for a closer look. When they arrived, somebody answered the door. In November 1993, the tight-knit community living around picturesque Rutland Water was growing concerned about the whereabouts of two popular residents, Derek and Eileen Severs.
The picture that evolved was again strengthening the case for a full investigation, because never in all the years that they'd lived there and all the people they knew had they just gone off the map.
When officers arrived at Derek and Eileen's home, the door was opened by their son, 37-year-old Roger Severs.
Roger was somebody I knew back in '93 from the Lamici wine bar. particularly when I was back home from university. I used to go down there for a beer or two a couple of times a week, and I knew people there, and we would chat about golf and music or whatever the issue was of the day.
To the young Nick Beggy, Roger cut a respectable figure.
He was well dressed. I can picture in my head now with his chinos, trousers and blazer, an open neck shirt, and he told us he was a grain buyer for Weetabix, and I can remember that very, very clearly.
Like his parents, Roger came across as a likeable and sociable character, and there was nothing to suggest that what he told the police at his parents' home was anything but true.
Roger said, oh, they've gone away for a week. He said that he dropped them off at Peterborough station and they'd taken a train south. And the last that he'd heard was a phone call from his mum on the 16th of November, which was 2 days before the officers visited.
2 days off the map is better than 5 days. But despite reassurances from Roger, police remained concerned about where Derek and Eileen might be and continued their missing persons investigation.
One of the neighbours told them that if they went away, they always came round and said, look after the house, do this, do that. They hadn't done that. But the police did an extensive investigation as to where they might have disappeared. So they went down to Peterborough, which is where they would have caught the train from, to go down to London, and they made inquiries there. Nobody had seen them. And they went to King's Cross just to double-check, which is the destination station, and there was nothing there either. Absolutely no sign of them.
At that time, there was no CCTV on the platforms in the stations. We didn't even have mobile phones. That made it a more difficult inquiry because everything had to be done the hard way. There was no technology, really, to assist.
While investigators made inquiries at hotels in the area they left for, they continued to speak to close friends of Derek and Eileen.
All of their friends looked mystified that, no, they can't have gone on holiday because she's supposed to be delivering the raffle prizes. He's supposed to be coming down the pub. Because if they were going on holiday, they would have told everybody.
The friends didn't just have lots to say about Derek and Eileen going on holiday. They also had lots to say about their son, Roger. He too was well known in the community.
Roger went on dates with people he met through the Lonely Hearts column, and he'd spin a real load of lies to them, pretending to be a big shot. And the truth is, he had a few menial jobs and hadn't even held on to them for very long. So he came out with elaborate stories of successes for big companies, business deals, claimed to have a flash motor, but it was always in the garage being fixed. He masqueraded as a high-flying businessman who just clinched a good deal. He'll tell everyone, I'm celebrating this success. And it was all baloney. There wasn't a shred of truth in it.
It was becoming pretty obvious that there was a certain level of disappointment from the family with their son, Roger. He'd had a good education. I think he went to public school and they expected more. His father had always been a high flyer.
He had never kept a job for more than a month or two normally. He was considered to be a huge disappointment to his parents, who'd been very, very successful in their own lives. And Roger turned out to be a layabout, lazy, didn't do whatever they wanted. And so they had stopped giving him money because they were fed up of giving him money because it was just going down the drain.
But there was more than just unmet expectations that was causing tension between Roger and his parents. There was also a recent fallout about finances.
Roger kept sponging off his parents, and in the end they got fed up. He wanted quite a lot of money for his latest business venture, and they said, stop, that's enough. We've paid all your debts. You've never actually succeeded in anything. We don't want to lose any more money on a wasted venture, so you're not having it.
Rumours also swirled that Derek and Eileen wanted to cut Roger from their will in favour of their grandson. Could this be a motive to murder? Roger's possible motive now made him a person of interest in his parents' disappearance. Officers paid him another visit at Derek and Eileen's home. This time, they asked to come inside for a closer look.
A detective sergeant asked for permission to search the house, and the house was untidy. These were people who had a spotlessly clean house, everything had a place, everything had a home in the house, and it was untidy, and more alarm bells started to sound. The sergeant and the constable who went with him noticed that the bathroom carpet and the kitchen carpet were both missing.
When officers questioned Roger about the carpet, he claimed his dad had dropped a chip pan, and that's why that section of carpet was missing. And again, the bathroom was the result of a spill, and he just passed it off as just being normal.
Roger's story was suspicious, but with no evidence linking him to his parents' disappearance, there was little the officers could do. Elsewhere, though, detectives had made a breakthrough. A police report, totally unconnected to the case, had been discovered and offered vital new clues.
On Monday, November the 15th, about 6:30, two officers were on their way to a call when they noticed Derek Severs' Blue Rover, which seemed out of place, and someone near it acting suspiciously. They stopped and asked him what he was doing. He said he was answering a call of nature, but they noticed there were some fertiliser bags nearby. And when questioned about those, he said he was looking for leaves to collect for leaf mould.
That person was Roger Severs. Steve and his team wasted no time rushing to the area where Roger had been seen acting suspiciously in Derek's car, hoping for a break in the case. A search of the site revealed no hard evidence. But where else had Roger been in Derek's distinctive car that day? Again, police reports held more clues, this time from a traffic officer's logbook.
Traffic officers had a nose, as good a nose as detectives for seeing things that were out of place, that they'd seen this car at a rubbish tip and that they'd seen Roger Severs with it, and it gave them an explanation which was believable, that he was just dropping stuff off. But they made a record of it, and because of that, the officers submitted this record. We had to then send a search team, and we sent our tactical unit to actually search this tip.
A meticulous forensic search began at the tip, looking for evidence that could connect Roger with the disappearance of his parents.
They were there for several days, going through every single bag and every article on this tip, and a really dirty job. And they did turn up some things. There was a blood-stained towel. Could be anybody's, couldn't be tied in.
Another blank. Now, a week into the investigation, Steve and his team were no closer to tracking down Derek and Eileen Severs. And with every passing day, the chances of finding them safe and well diminished. In November 1993, the small community of Rutland Water were growing increasingly concerned for Derek and Eileen Severs, a married couple who had now been missing for a week. The Severs' son, Roger, had told police his parents were away visiting London, a story detectives weren't convinced by when they'd spoken to him at his parents' home.
Everybody who went to the house said, although we'd got nothing, there was always this feeling, it was a general feeling, that it just wasn't right. The detectives were aware that there were carpets missing in the bathroom and the kitchen, and the excuses that had been given by the son for their absence were a little bit thin. They didn't seem to really fit.
Investigators were now becoming increasingly worried that Derek and Eileen had come to harm.
Everything pointed to the fact that there'd been foul play, because it was sort of a week on from the last contact with anybody, and that was another major concern. If it had been a day, 2 days, you can deal with that. A week, you know that you're not going to find them alive, and that is always heart-wrenching, really, because a missing person inquiry is now a murder inquiry.
And the man Leicestershire police believed could be responsible for the disappearance of Derek and Eileen was their son, Roger. But they still didn't have any hard evidence to prove that Roger had killed his parents.
Even though the evidence wasn't conclusive, it was all circumstantial. It was all pointing in the direction that the parents had been killed. He was the prime suspect.
Steve and his team had to take a huge gamble, which could risk blowing any case against Roger.
And because we got no bodies, but also because of the fact that there was always a chance that Roger might try and leave the country, he was arrested on suspicion of murder, which again was something that was unusual. But if we'd let him go, who knows where he'd have ended up, whether we'd have managed to get him back. It was a really odd case.
Steve's decision to formally arrest Roger did provide investigators with an opportunity to strengthen the case against him.
To move things on, we really needed to get into that house and to do a proper forensic search of the property. And the only way we could achieve that, because he wasn't consenting to that sort of search, was to actually arrest him on suspicion of the murder, and that would in turn give us the opportunity to get into the house and do a proper forensic search of the property.
Steve had rolled the dice and now relied on his forensic team to find the evidence that could link Roger to the suspected murder of Derek and Eileen.
My role in Leicestershire Constabulary at the time was the crime scene manager. So effectively, if there's any serious crime, then I would be called in to manage all the sort of various angles that needed to be done. Normally I would get called in when there was a body or some very serious offence had taken place, but this was a little bit unusual because it was very much a case of, well, we don't quite know what's happened. We had a set of circumstances, and obviously we wanted to get more information as to what we thought could have actually happened. It didn't look bright because they'd been missing for a while, but we had an open mind about the whole thing. As a crime scene investigator, one is always looking out for any evidence that might give more credence to one story or another story.
The crime scene search was soon uncovering interesting and unusual documents that reinforced investigators' suspicions about Roger.
The police found an important piece of evidence during the search, and it was Roger's 14-point to-do list. Wheelbarrow, clean. Rubbish. Mum's car, clean. Dad's car, clean. Clean bathroom. Check shed. Pictures. Fire, check it's out. Deliver other prize. Check hotels. Ashes. Cut down shrubs. Point 13, little garage. And point 14, dump.
Were these mundane household chores to tick off, or a murderer's to-do list? And could Roger's clean-up plans mean forensic evidence had been wiped away? Undeterred, Orlando and his team first examined the bathroom, where some missing carpet had aroused suspicions on the officers' first search.
It was fairly obvious that this bathroom was not as it should be, inasmuch as all the carpets had been stripped and it was down to the bare wood. Having established there was something odd going on there, we then investigate the rest of the house in a similar sort of manner, going through each room and looking at it almost on hands and knees to see if there's any evidence of anything else that looks untoward.
While Orlando and other members of his team scoured through the rest of the property, on-call scientist Peter Lamb arrived on scene to inspect the bathroom in closer detail.
I began to examine the bathroom and toilet, and I noticed that there were 1 or 2 tiny specks of blood, but not in the usual place that you find blood in people's homes. You would normally expect to find blood on the carpets or the flooring, maybe on the tops of the sink, where if you cut yourself shaving, you might drip a piece of blood and then forget to wipe it up. But in this case, there was nothing like that. The fact that these were tiny pieces of blood was unusual, because if you cut yourself shaving and a drip forms and drips off, in forensic terms, that is a lot of blood. The tiny specks of blood which I was finding normally indicate some sort of blunt force injury. Now, we use a chemical enhancement technique, and on a lot of surfaces where I couldn't see any blood whatsoever, I was getting a very weak positive reaction, which tends to suggest that there was blood there to start with, but somebody has made an attempt to clean it off.
The blood spatter is something, but the attempt to clean the blood is worrying. As they suspected, the killer had clearly taken time to destroy any forensic evidence. But, as Peter quickly discovered, they hadn't covered up all of their tracks.
And I decided, strangely enough, to lay on the floor and look up. When I lay on the floor and looked up, I could see blood staining underneath the toilet, underneath the sink, and on the return edges of the bath fascia panel. They were the type of blood staining that you would expect if blood had run down these areas, pooled underneath and started to drip from those areas. The faces that you could see from standing up or sitting down, they'd all been cleaned. But the underneaths, where you wouldn't see if you were in those positions, hadn't been cleaned at all. This tended to suggest that originally there was quite a lot of blood had been shed. The amount of blood that I saw led me to believe that somebody had been seriously injured there. The amount of blood that potentially was there that had been cleaned up was a life-threatening amount of blood, I would suggest.
Finally, police had forensic evidence to suggest an attack had taken place in the bathroom. But obviously, there was no body at the scene, meaning it must have been moved, crucially leaving a forensic trail in blood.
I searched the flooring between there and the exits, and although there was no visible blood along that route, I used the chemical enhancement technique and found traces of blood which were invisible to the eye along most of the route between the bathroom, through the hallway, through the kitchen, and then into the garage, which was attached to the house.
The trail of blood wasn't the only forensic clue that Peter uncovered.
But whilst I was looking at that, I also found some fibres, a yellowy green looking fibre, tiny, barely visible to the naked eye, but they had the appearance of rolled up hay bales that you see in fields. You know, the finding of fibres in itself is probably not unusual, but the appearance of these was particularly unusual in this instance. That, together with not being able to find any blood from somebody who was clearly bleeding heavily, led me to believe that maybe the person had been wrapped in something and dragged through the house. The scenes of crime officers had finished their work, pulled the garage door down, and they'd noticed that there was some blood staining on the outside of the garage door. So I had a look at it, tested it, it was certainly blood, and the distribution of it was such that, again, in my view, somebody had been beaten repeatedly. So there'd been blows into wet blood, which had caused the blood to spatter, and some of it had landed on the garage door. That could have only happened when the garage door was closed, not when it was open. That led to the decision that either two people had been injured in separate areas, or the person who'd been injured in the bathroom had been able to get up and then had been further assaulted outside. And it wasn't until we'd done some preliminary blood typing that we were able to say that it was two people who were involved in this. One person had been assaulted outside near the garage door, and another person had been assaulted inside the house in the bathroom.
Forensic investigators had now found significant evidence to suggest this was definitely a murder inquiry, not a missing persons search. But the question still remained. Where were Derek and Eileen, and what had happened to them? Police in England's smallest county had been investigating the disappearance of a retired couple, Derek and Eileen Severs, for 2 weeks. Forensic evidence suggested they had been murdered in their home in rural Rutland Water. The prime suspect, their 37-year-old son, Roger. However, there was still one important part of the case against him that was missing. Police had still not found their bodies.
Rutland was a massive area. It's often easier to search a more residential area than it is a rural area. We've just got masses of open fields and water. I mean, we've got the lake there. Who was to say that they hadn't gone out in a boat and waited and dumped into the reservoir? It was, it really was, you know, wet your finger and stick it in the air, and where do we start?
The starting point turned out to be not far from the Severs' home, their back garden.
Mr. Severs was a very keen gardener, and when they were searching the house, they found in the garden that there were traces where soil had been removed, which again seemed unusual, not frighteningly unusual, but unusual that there was quite an amount of soil that was missing.
Had the soil been removed to create a shallow grave? Officers dug into the soil, expecting to find the bodies of the Severs. But the garden wasn't a graveyard after all. Officers might have been frustrated by their search of the garden, but the garage was about to yield more answers. Notably, Derek's pride and joy, his blue Rover.
What seemed odd to me at the time was that it looked a little bit muddy, a little bit grubby, but when we looked in through the window onto the dashboard, we could see that there was a whole series of cleaning tokens. And this family were really scrupulously clean. So this seemed really quite odd to me. It seemed very, very strange that you got all these cleaning tokens and yet the car was muddy and grubby. This is something that piqued my interest, sort of thinking, this isn't quite right. You know, this doesn't fit the theory I have of the people that lived here and how they lived. So it became quite a focal point quite quickly as to what's happening here. So obviously this looks interesting, more interesting than if it was just any old car. We then examined it, and there were traces of mud on the inside smeared, and there was also positive for blood stains as well in the boot. The hypothesis was that perhaps this car had been used to remove the bodies from the house.
The forensic search of the crime scene suggested that both Derek and Eileen were now dead. But where were their bodies? In a bid to find their location, detectives needed to turn up the heat on Roger, now being questioned in police custody.
Two of our best interviewers, they had a really good go at him over a long period of time, and he just wasn't budging. He was sticking to the same old story, and a decision had still got to be made, because you either let him go or you charge him, because things were starting to stack up against him. So he was charged without a confession, without a body.
And without that confession, investigators had to go back to the drawing board. Based on the evidence they did have, crime scene manager Orlando Elmhurst had an idea to narrow down the search area. Once again, Derek's car would provide the clues.
The wheel arches, in particular, were caked in mud, and I thought that could potentially hold some information that we could progress with. I thought, right, well, let's contact the archaeology department. I phoned them up and sort of said, look, is there anything or anyone there who could do anything with mud? Because obviously we have the situation of these missing people and we are desperate to find them. And after a few phone calls, I ended up talking to Dr. Tony Brown, who said that he thought he could do something with it.
Could this mud lead detectives to the murdered couple?
It was about 2 weeks later that Tony Brown got back in contact with us, and he sort of constructed an environmental profile from the contents of the soil on the wheel arches, that the scene would be a road verge or parking place by water, as used by fishermen, in or adjacent to woodland with a significant proportion of oak, horse chestnut, ash and lime. The wood edge also borders onto arable fields and pastures and located on or adjacent to soils derived from Lincolnshire limestone. So he's giving us a very good particular environmental picture of where we should be looking. He had some places in mind that he thought could be viable and would fit that description, and he would then try and narrow that number down to see if he could pinpoint where it could have come from. He ultimately pinpointed 3 potential sites: Exton Wood, and there's Hambleton Wood, and there was Armley Wood. We could then hone our search area, and within 2 days, they'd struck lucky.
I believe that the officer actually felt the earth moving under his feet, and then plunged his hand into loose soil and actually felt cold flesh.
3 weeks after they were last seen, investigators had found Derek and Eileen Severs.
When you find bodies, there's mixed feelings really. One is sadness, obviously, because we knew in our heart of hearts that they were dead. So finding them, it confirmed that. So there is a sadness, but at the same time, there's an elation as well, because you know that you've got the right person. Everything that's been done by everybody working together has led you to this conclusion.
But it wasn't just the bodies of Derek and Eileen that investigators had found. Other pieces of the puzzle also fell into place.
When they found the bodies, they were able to compare the soil in the garden with the soil at the scene and actually say 100% this came from the Severs garden.
It would seem a reasonable assumption to suggest that some of that soil had been taken away. Again, perhaps it was too difficult to dig a deep enough hole to put the 2 bodies in, together with a blanket and other things. And so soil was taken from the property and used to fill over like that.
And the soil wasn't the only forensic match found in this shallow grave by the water's edge.
The bodies were wrapped in yellowy green blankets, and these blanket fibres matched little bits of piles that we'd seen in the hallway.
It would also explain why there wasn't a lot of blood on the carpets and on the flooring, because the majority of it would have been absorbed by, as we know it now, a blanket, a thick blanket.
News of the shocking discovery soon rippled across Rutland and was particularly significant for Richard Hallam, who had spotted a strange car just weeks prior.
When I realised that the bodies had been found over in the woods, and I then put the two and two together, it was just an absolute, my God, something that I thought was a little bit strange at the time, to all of a sudden realising, my goodness me, you know, it could have been Roger with his parents in the car. It arouses all sorts of emotions, you know.
Even after the bodies were found, for many, the discovery only led to more questions.
I just wonder what went through their minds when they thought they were going to die at the hands of their own son, their own flesh and blood. This was such an unnatural crime. We're programmed to care for our parents in dotage, and he took the lives from the people who gave him his own life. Their kindness and their love over many years, the support, the money that they poured into his useless business ventures, and how does he repay them? He murders them in cold blood so he can have their luxury lifestyle for himself.
A year later, the case went to trial at Nottingham Crown Court. Based on all of the forensic evidence, prosecutors put forward what they believed happened on the 13th of November, 1993.
During an argument with his mother in the house, he took a steak mallet and repeatedly beat her about the head. Derek drove home, and we know that he was ambushed by his son. Roger Severs brutally bludgeoned his father to death in the garage of the home and left him to die.
The overwhelming forensic evidence was enough to convince the jury that Roger Severs was guilty. He was given 2 life sentences in December 1994.
When you've got so little to go on, it was really the science that actually took us there, and that's the amazing thing about science. It moves on, doesn't it?
The use of forensic science, and particularly using it in this novel way, really moved on that inquiry quite significantly. It is possible the bodies would not have been discovered for ages, in which case all the other evidence which could have pointed to a particular killer would have disappeared.
Đứng không ở gôn, bóng tự đến chân. Cứ đâu em cứ chửi thằng áo xanh, bịt mẹ thằng cái đéo ngu thế. Nhìn nhau, để chỉ em xem nhau nói thằng kia thì bây giờ tôi cứ tì vai nào dậy chịu thật nó cứ nói được chịu. Cái quả sắt đẩy em ở bên mé bên này cơ, nó đâu đẩy cả lưới đấy. Xong có quả em dốc được cái là đéo sắt được. Cứ hích bắt đầu em lách rồi cái nước không săn được. Trong bọn này đít nó cứ tay tay. Đầu tiên mà cầm báo nó vào nó ổn mạnh lắm đi. Sau đó lên tay nó ổn. Cái đằng nào đấy nó khử tay để dí luôn. Giá danh rồi bố phải uống sau thì chơi thì nó có cái thú vui của nó. Chơi đá bóng rất nhiều cái nó buồn cười. Rồi thì bố xài nữa rồi. nhật một trong hai ngày.
7 phần nay cầm đi đâu rồi vậy?
Này thứ bảy bố rồi. Và thứ bảy hoặc chủ nhật, cần một trong hai ngày đấy.
Ông đi bia chưa? Đúng.
Biết thôi. Mai nếu uống cộng vui.
Vui giấu đi. Tao thì giấu cái vui.
Cộng vui gấp đôi, nhân đôi chẳng hạn.
Tao không biết giấu gì là vui.
Vui nhân đôi.
Giấu không nhập.
Thế là buồn rồi. Cũng phải làm sân mai đánh là hợp lý.
Cái gì nhẹ mấy con lời. Con thì 1.400.000, con thì 1.300.000.
Tóm lại 900 chốt.
Mà cả 900 lấy không, làm thôi gì.
Đây là 3 giờ một năm nhé.
Một năm phải 4 giờ 5 giờ.
Mai có sân kể cả 13 giờ
4 ghi một tháng.
12 giờ luôn.
Tháng 4 ghi.
4 ghi một
À, 4
ngày.
ghi một ngày nhầm.
Thế đặt sân đến từ 5 giờ đến 7 giờ. Anh nhỉ? 7 giờ là đẹp. Hoặc là từ 6 đến 8, một trong hai khung đấy. 5 đến 7 thôi. 5 sợ nó hơi nóng. Có mấy giờ bọn mày đánh nóng quá, bọn mày không chịu được. Nóng, mồ hôi ra nhiều, về uống nhiều.
Cái gì uống được kéo đâu, uống bữa nghỉ 2 bữa gì.
Đâu giờ cậu ai mà tao hứa tao nghỉ đến cuối tháng mà tao không nghỉ. Nhiều. Thế đánh từ 7 giờ đến 8 giờ luôn đi.
Thế 7 giờ 8 giờ.
Từ 5 giờ. Đến 1 tiếng. Từ 5 giờ đến 8 giờ luôn. Thôi 7 giờ giống người đánh đâu thì đánh cũng mấy anh em đánh 2 tiếng mà chối. Không thiếu người đâu. Có người thì đã đánh mình chia ra đây ra có 5-6 người chia ra đánh thay nhau.
Đây là cái gì chứ?
Dương cái này có con nào không ạ?
Không, cái gì?
Trong tối nay mình sẽ đi đánh.
Đây à?
Đánh rồi. Thứ bảy. Có được ít được bao nhiêu tiền?
Có thằng nào có bằng lái xe cứng không?
Có.
Cho mượn cái.
Không ở đây. Đi cả.
Đi.
Nhưng không ở đây.
Ở đâu?
Ở đây có số xe. Tiến có.
Cầm đi không? À, chỉ bằng mềm mà.
Bằng từ mấy chục năm trước.
Đưa cái bằng lái ô tô đi.
Ô tô phí đây thì có.
Đưa đi. Không được. Phải là bằng lái xe ô tô.
Cái từ 15.800.
Thế rồi á?